I'm going to ask a few questions to get the discussion rolling, and then we'll open up for a broader discussion. We'll go around with a mic. I'd ask everybody, actually first I'd ask everybody to turn off their cell phones or anything that goes beep. And then secondly, when we do go around with the microphone, I'll just ask people to stand, identify themselves, and to ask a question concisely. So, General Kelly, welcome. Good to be with you again. Let me just start by asking you to talk about Southcom. You know, what is it? What does it cover? And really, what is your job as the COCOM for Southern Command?
I think probably everyone here knows that there are 6 geographical combatant commanders, one, and PACOM, Pacific Command, another, Central Command in the Middle East, the Africa Command, European Command, and Northern Command, which is the United States, with responsibilities of interacting with Mexico and Canada. In my part of the world, I have all of the Caribbean and everything south of Mexico. With the exception, actually, the Bahamas. I don't quite know why that's the case. And then the U.S. possession, not possession, but the U.S. Puerto Rico is an example, American Virgin Islands. So, large area, English-speaking Caribbean, very different than the Latin American or the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Latin American. One of the things I learned very early on, they are really different countries. There's a tendency in the United States to think, well, everyone down there is the same. They're not. They have their own wonderful countries. They have their own, very similar languages and religion, that kind of thing. But they're, the Colombians are very different in terms of the history and the things that make them proud than the Bolivians and so it's a very different place. So that's the geographical part. I'll get it out early with Cuba. Have nothing to do with Cuba, and we see I don't a U.S. government, State Department work in that. Some potential for the future. We can probably talk about that. But what do I do? The 3 things I do more than anything else is I partner with those nations, and the vast majority of the nations in the region, like the United States, and see the United States as a very definite partner. Wish actually there was more partnership, and I don't mean money. I mean just serious interest partnership in the region. Tremendous trade relations with Latin America, and generally speaking, very good political and military relationships. Some of the countries we don't. Venezuela is an issue. Ecuador, Bolivia. That's their choice. I don't. We can talk about that, but I don't mean to criticize. But that's their choice, and they're going in a direction that most people in the region don't understand at all. I'll let it go with that. So partnering. The other thing, a great deal of, is part of that partnering was working with them, planning with them, standing by to help them in the case of humanitarian disaster. We have everything from hurricanes in the Caribbean, as you might imagine, is kind of the primary concern. Had no idea how many volcanoes there are in the region. The Central American Isthmus is an example of huge tectonic plate shifts, so constant almost earthquakes in places like Chile and in Peru. So we partner with them in any pandemics and things like that. So any of the humanitarian assistance, which is the second thing, and then finally drug interdiction, partnering with them at the source to try to get at the source of drugs. You may or may not know that 100% of the heroin, cocaine, and most of the methamphetamines now that are brought into the United States are made in Latin America. Huge business, all driven by our drug demand. Huge profits that then get turned into some real detrimental effects on the countries that we deal with in terms of bribery, extortion, murder, that kind of thing, corruption in general. We're very effective in seeing electronically and otherwise the movement of the cocaine or drugs. Don't have a lot of assets to stop it, although we do stop a lot, but not nearly enough. As an example, last year, just cocaine alone, 191 metric tons of cocaine. Collectively, we stopped, captured, 0 violence, but still money gets thrown. So maybe that's enough.
Yeah. Let me ask you just one particular Southcom related question, then I'll, well, 2. The first is, I think most of us tend to think of the Colombia experience as a great American success story. Plan Colombia, bipartisan. The Colombian government really tremendously successful against the FARC. And of course now culminating in a peace process with some issues, but culminating. So one question I would ask you on that is, how translatable do you think that model is to other parts of the world? I mean, that's, if you want a really good success, that's it. But does it translate?
I think it does. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure it would in an entirely other culture, but I've come to learn that the things that the number one thing that changed the dynamic relative to Colombia was the Colombian people finally having that, that ta-da moment that said, if we don't do something, we are going to be a failed state. We will not be able, the people who have any money at all, we're not going to be able to live here. A number of conferences we've had in Southcom, we've done it up here as well, you've attended a couple of them. The recognition by the Colombians are that we were at least as bad, that they were at least as bad 20 years ago as the Central American republics are today. Nearly failed states, all driven by our drug consumption in the United States in terms of the corruption and the murders and all that to a large degree. And in fact, to kind of export the Colombian experience, and again, it started with the Colombian people changing, and they've changed their tax code, and the military changed to be much more human rights friendly, if you will, a lot more coin versus trying to shoot their way out of the war, that kind of thing. But 20 years ago, I think 80% of the countryside of Colombia, something like that, was either controlled by or influenced heavily by the FARC. Today it's 4 or 5%, and going down. 20 years ago, 80% of the Colombian population were at least sympathetic to what the FARC was doing, or trying to do. Today it's tiny. So taking that as the model, we had conferences, and again, you've seen a couple of them, to where we took spokespersons, the current Colombian ambassador to the United States, formerly Pinzon, formerly the Minister of Defense, great guy, to say the least. I mean, Princeton, speaks English fluently. I asked him to come to Miami, where we had a conference with the Central Americans, primarily focused on Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But everyone came. We invited from Mexico all the way to the Mexicans came, and not their presidents, but their pretty senior military guys. The only country that didn't come was Nicaragua, which is a disappointment because we have not a bad relationship with them. Mill-to-mill, counter-drug. But anyways, I asked then Minister of Defense Pinzon if he wouldn't basically do a seminar focused on the Central American countries about where his country was 20 years ago and what they did over the last 20 years to get to the point now where they're just about to end a 52, almost 53-year insurgency. And it was just nothing less than brilliant. And from that, two things really, that because the countries are so small and they're on this trafficking route, they can't do it alone. So they've got to take a regional approach. And they finally came together and understood that. And then the other issue was to come up with a plan that could be presented to the United States and other countries, much like Plan Colombia. This is what we think we need, economically, socially, militarily. This is what we think, law enforcement, this is what we think we need. Over time, and we helped them in Miami, it grew into what is known as the Alliance for Prosperity. And that subsequently presented to our president, our vice president here in Washington, and we had great hopes, and it's still out there, and we're still looking for. It's not the Alliance for Prosperity is what they're going to do for themselves, but it gives a start point for what people might do to help. So I think it is exportable.
Second question, I think, in light of what happened in Paris, I think one has to ask, as you look at your area of responsibility, think about Islamic State, but also Hezbollah and so forth. Are those issues that are relevant at all, or is that really a Middle Eastern, European, North African kind of phenomenon?
They're everywhere. It's everywhere. the way I think of the networks that encase the world, or almost encase the world, is I've come to learn in the job I'm in now that there's a transnational organized criminal network that is just encases the world. And anything that you want to buy or anything you want to move on that network for a cost. So drugs in our own country, the United States, hundreds and hundreds of tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine move into the United States in exactly the right amounts to feed our drug demand. I don't even worry about marijuana because it doesn't flow from Latin America, it flows from Mexico, and of course most of it's grown, or much of it's grown in the United States now. But I'm told thousands of tons of that move on that same network. Tens of thousands of human beings. The UN tells us that every year at least roughly 20,000 young women, mostly kind of late adolescence, very early adulthood, move on that network for the sex trade. Not to mention economic refugees, aliens of special interest that we don't quite know what they're up to, but we know they're up to no good. And if you want something in a sense that comes out of Central America or another part of the world, that network, this transnational organized criminal network, will bring it to you here in Washington. So that very, very well developed networks around the world. They're not, no one person controls them, but they are all interactive. I think the way I envision it, the Islamic terrorist network, Islamic extremist network, is very well developed in Central America, in Centcom, in the Middle East, and is getting more and more sophisticated as it grows out of the Middle East into the same northern Africa, now going down into lower parts of Africa. I think Paris and other indicators will tell you that it's pretty well developed in parts of Western Europe. In the part of the world I live in, I know that some amount of money out of the tremendous, eye-watering profits of the drug trade. Cocaine alone is in the neighborhood of something like $85 billion a year. That has to be laundered. The traffickers, their biggest problem is not getting drugs into the United States, laundering money. We know that it's laundered in part through various banking interests that have reached back to, say, the Lebanese banks, and we know that Hezbollah takes a certain, gets a certain benefit. We don't know how much, but we know it's a lot. Again, in terms of the ISIS, there are several very, very radicalized mosques in the Caribbean region. We know that some number, upwards, certainly past 100, probably less than 200, of young people have gone to the fight in Syria. Recently, a pretty high visibility kill of a Trinidadian was in Syria. My concern with ISIS, and of course the ISIS and other Islamic radicals, the message kind of more and more is stay where you are and do your work. Meaning don't get into Syria, just do it whether it's in Chattanooga or in Trinidad Tobago or in Montego Bay, Jamaica, or wherever. So the concern I would have, and again, it's as I'm reminded constantly, it's not a military concern, it's more of a law enforcement concern. But that's probably my greatest, in my part of the world, my greatest concern is local radicalized, of which there are a fair number, who just stay in the region and do dirty work against soft targets. Think of the cruise industry. There are millions of Americans that enjoy cruises out of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa, Texas, one-day stops in wonderful countries, but a very soft target.
Oh, thanks. I'm going to be going on a cruise with my wife in January. Bring my Kevlar. Let me change the direction a little bit, ask just two final questions, then we'll open it up. It does seem to me that you're part of a generation of general officers, people who came in really at the end of Vietnam or after Vietnam, and who've been leading our country's armed forces ever since 9/11 and over 14 years of war. I guess I'm curious whether at first you'd accept that characterization and what you think of that generation, how you assess that generation as compared to other generations. How should we think about it, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
I think it's a great question, and it's something that I've gotten into a lot of reading over the years. For some reason, fell into the Civ Mill reading kind of block. I am actually one of the very last people that would have, year groups that would have gotten a draft notice. And as we were talking a little earlier, I'm from Boston. It's a marine town, not to say that you don't have great soldiers come out of Boston, but in my neighborhood at least, you get your draft notice, move down, if you pass your draft physical, you then join the Marine Corps. No self-respecting guy would go into the service. And in the Marine Corps I was in the barracks, as an E1, E2, E3, I had 1 year of college. And the vast majority of the people in my unit were wonderful guys, but very low high school graduation rates, very high rate of marijuana use, not so much the other drugs, but marijuana use. Rough crowd, but all of them combat veterans, 1, 2, 3 tours in Vietnam. But a very, very troublesome group of guys. Very hard to deal with in terms of discipline. The Army was worse off, and the U.S. Army was worse off, for a lot of different reasons. But in my view, the social tinkering that went on with our Army in the mid '60s brought it to the way they were required to fight the Vietnam War. At the end of all of that, in the very early 1970s, our Army was predictably broken. The Marine Corps, I would say, was just 1 percentage point from broken. And so people like me, having had to go into service, and then, in my view, electing to stay, or in my case, electing to stay, I was a second lieutenant in 75, 76, and until today. We never want that to happen again. And the people who brought us out of that period, I think, were very, very brave men and women, mostly men back then. The Barry McCaffreys of the world, the General Lou Wilson of my service, who saw what happened to their military, how badly we fought the Vietnam War. We were required to fight that war. It's social tinkering that McNamara 100,000.
Project 100,000, yeah.
That I did not realize was actually 300,000. I didn't realize that.
No.
I recently read there was actually about 300,000. But the point is, the generation whose shoulders I stand on, again, the McCaffreys and people like that, were really heroic guys, because every one of their class, if you will, got out and were disgusted with the way the services were and the way our government and they stayed and they rebuilt the U.S. military. And so when we went to war after 9/11, vastly different military than it was certainly when I was enlisted. We owe them a great deal. So people give us, myself and my generation credit. We stand on their shoulders, and there's no rational reason in the world why those guys stayed in and undid the damage in the 70s. There's no reason other than their love of their service and love of their country.
So, I really will stop asking questions and let them ask questions in a minute, but I've got to follow that one up. So, what do you think the next generation of general officers will be like? The guys who are now, the 06s, maybe 1-stars, how will they be different from your generation?
I hope they're not different. I think I come from a generation of people of doubters, there's very, very few good ideas that come out of this city. In terms of military, it's all out there where the troops are training, the lieutenants are given elbow room to train properly, where we have a great education. One of the things I've come to realize in the U.S. military, and I work closely with the State Department, great people, very, very good friends. But the thing that we have developed in the U.S. military is this cradle-to-grave professional military education. And I'm not talking about education is different than training. Thinking, cradle to grave. You know, when you're a captain, you go to a school. When you're a major, you go to a school. When you're a lieutenant colonel, there are seminars along the way. It's a cradle to grave education process where you get people, you know, you essentially take a year off, go to school, and talk and think about science and the art of war. So that when you are confronted with tactical problems, you know, there was a lot made about when the war when we went, I was in the original invasion of Iraq, when it went from this, you know, maneuver, you know, tanks and things like that effort, and in my case, took me from Kuwait all the way to Beijing. I mean, I think it's the longest, I know it's the longest single movement in U.S. Marine Corps history, 650 miles. It might be, I don't know the difference from Normandy, the distance, it's got to be, takes you at least into Germany.
Yeah.
It's that kind of a distance. And of course, U.S. Army did the same thing on the left flank. But when we had that summer of '03 when things started to turn in another direction, I didn't have anyone say, I mean, there was points made in the press about this. On the ground in Iraq, there was no one saying, gee, now they're using IEDs and they're shooting at us. And in terms of guerrilla warfare, I don't know how to deal with this. Certainly, my experience, to include U.S. Army units that I worked with, you know, immediately switched to a coin type strategy. But there was some, you know, chatter in the press and whatnot about how some people were complaining they hadn't been trained for this. My point is, I think as long as we continue this education process and don't focus the officers, NCOs, the young troops on a style of war, this is a very complicated period. I mean, we will have to do armor mechanized warfare or carrier against, you know, dogfight, all of the conventional end, all the way to what I think is probably the most likely end, and that would be an Iraq, Afghanistan type engagement, or what we're trying to pull off here in Syria. And I think that's dirty business on that end of the spectrum. It's really hard. One of the things that I'm going on too long, but one of the things they didn't mean to do it, they didn't plan to do it, but the Iraqi insurgents in 2003, 2004 essentially negated almost everything we are as a military force, which is so dependent, or we're so used to, and we employ high-tech electronics and all that, and they literally negated all of that advantage. And then it became just infantry guys, again, looking for insurgents. Brilliantly done, but they didn't really actually plan to do it. The first few weeks, months in 2003, when they came at us with guns, they realized they lost every engagement. And then we went into this lull, and then the ID started. And they were onto something there, and they realized it. But we then, again, because we have educated officers now at the junior level and NCOs, they adjusted to that pretty quickly. Did we take our hits? We sure did. But we figured it out, is the point.
Okay, absolute last question, just as a Bostonian. So what is it with the Boston Irish and the Marine Corps?
Well, it's the Marine Corps rock.
You, General Dunford, I mean, you guys are everywhere.
I don't know. Boston used to be a huge Navy Marine Corps town. When I was a kid growing up, we had permanently assigned aircraft carriers. That's when we had a
Really?
big
Wow.
Navy, USS Wasp and a couple other carriers. We had, I think, probably a couple of dozen destroyers, cruisers. We had a Marine barracks there that had 1,100 Marines. So I think it's, you know, kind of part of that, and even though there's almost nothing up there to include Army, Air Force, it stayed behind, if you will. So I think kind of an interesting early on in the Marine Corps history of the Civil War period, we were called the Irish soldiers, and it was because when the Irish immigrants would get off the boats, they could speak English, or kind of, and they would recruit them right there, give them a job right on the spot, and the large eastern cities had Marine barracks in them, hundreds, if not a couple thousand Marines. So when we were just prior to the Civil War and then during the Civil War, they they were the only federal standing troops. But there was always this large contingent in Boston. Actually, there's a story during the capturing slaves and returning them to the slave owners in the South, and actually they called out the Marines because there were riots about not doing that, and actually the Marines were sympathetic to the rioters for not returning these slaves back to that had been captured on the Underground Railroad. So I don't know. I'm guessing here, but Boston does love its Marines.
Amen. Charlie Stevenson.
Joe, how are you?
Yeah, you might, if you could bring up the mic.
Charlie Stevenson. I used to be at the National War College, and now I'm at SICE. General, because of your breadth of experience, I'd like to get your personal and professional views on defense reform. Do we need to rebalance the relations between the service chiefs and the combatant commanders? Do we need to rebalance the roles of senior military and senior civilians in the Pentagon? Do we need to look at roles and missions again, especially given our heavy reliance on special operations forces?
I've done my level best to figure out what the problem is, and I do think anytime you have a system, you should look at it periodically and try to tweak it or make it better. But, I'm a combatant commander. I have nothing but great, and I've never heard a combatant commander say anything about a service chief other than thanks for doing the best you can to support them. So there's no, to the best of my knowledge, no tension between the service chiefs and the combatant commanders. I'm the combatant commander that gets almost nothing. And I understand that, kind of, because, I say, I wouldn't make a joke, but, there is no military threat from Latin America. No one's going to invade us. But we do have this network that brings drugs in huge amounts into the United States. The end result of that is this year, 44,000 Americans will die of drug overdoses, mostly, vast majority from the stuff that comes up from my part of the world. Somehow I think that's a threat of some type. We don't seem to be doing an awful lot about it because we're, our Navy and our, ISR and whatnot are in other parts of the world. But again, I'm the COCOM that tries to mitigate by working with our unbelievable great allies like Colombia and, of course, the FBI and the DEA and people like that. But I have never heard anyone complain about the services not providing everything they can provide to the COCOMs that, even in my own case, I get some support, and it's great support. So the first issue, I don't see the tension between service chiefs. I don't see the issues of roles and missions at all. I think, again, I think we'd be making a mistake if we didn't have a force that was agile across the force, ready to operate at any end. The Special Forces guys are, in fact, very focused and do wonderful things within that focus area. I think the other services have to be much more agile and prepared to do things across a broader spectrum. Charlie, we've been through this before. The one thing I would argue for is I think we should look at how the U.S. interagencies. I think that if we're going to take a look at maybe studying and then coordinating it, how the interagency operates overseas. It's still very stovepiped. It's still personality dependent. I have great relationships with FBI, DEA, right down the line, State Department, but it's oftentimes personality dependent. I think there's great study to be done about an interagency kind of Goldwater Nichols.
Gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. Inigo Guevara. I'm with Janes. I'm a defense consultant there. And my question is, General, do you think that Cuba should be under Southcom, or would it be preferable for it to be under Northcom, so that Northcom could leverage its relationship with Mexico to improve U.S. ties with Cuba directly? Thank you.
Yeah. Probably for the foreseeable future, Cuba will be a very, very slow process of improvement. The opening of relations with Cuba fairly positive event in my part of the world, mostly actually from the point of view of the countries that I deal with, which are friendly, saying, you know, kind of about time. Now there's no reason to criticize you guys in our little meetings, in the meetings we have amongst ourselves. I think interesting now that the U.S., I think, you know, and I don't work Cuba, but I think the U.S. was hoping this would go faster. And U.S. being, you know, the administration's, the big U.S. And I think the Cubans are wanting it to go slower. That's kind of ironic. But I wouldn't, for right now, it's probably where it ought to be. And if it, we all hope that things really start to blossom, and you know, the people will be better off. But you know, you're still dealing with a fairly repressive regime without a lot of political freedom. Certainly no freedom of the press, human rights issues, to say the least. All of those things have to change. So, and I think they will over time. I pray they will, because people in the 21st century deserve better than what the Cuban people have in terms of those things I just mentioned. Economically, I think it's already started to improve. I think the big thing now is people coming back with Cuban cigars. That's kind of the big thing in Miami right now. But there'll always be Cuban cigars in Miami. But.
Yeah, I was going to say, they were there before.
But yeah, I think it's probably where it ought to be. And really, right now, it's State Department that's managing the relationship. We just had an interesting, we do a lot of conferences, human rights conferences that I sponsor all over the region. We do humanitarian assistance conferences, just in case, drug trafficking type conferences. I have offered certainly to the State Department, you know, it might make sense. That's low-level military to military contact. It's in everyone's interest, those topics, to be ready. That might be something that we invite the Cubans to. The USNS Comfort just finished its 90-day deployment. Saw 125,000 patients. Phenomenal deployment. It was in Haiti, and I suggested to State maybe that we invite the Cubans have some patient or have some doctors in Port-au-Prince, maybe invite them aboard. We did that. They came aboard, and it was a great couple of days that they were aboard the ship, and then they invited some of our docs from the Comfort to go into Port-au-Prince and see their clinics. Tiny step, but a good step.
Gentleman in the second row.
Thanks. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Luis Alonso with the AP. Many thanks for this opportunity. General, I would like to ask you about Venezuela. They claim that a U.S. Coast Guard plane violated the national airspace early this month, and their defense minister described completely unusual not only the plane incident, but also the fact that the aircraft, George Washington, will be near Venezuela by the time of the legislative elections on December the 6th. If you could please, would like to give a comment about that. Thank you.
I always start off a comment about Venezuela by saying, I hope this doesn't hurt their feelings. And I don't mean the Venezuelan people. But I spent exactly no time thinking about Venezuela. They're on a path that only the Venezuelan people can change. We obviously always stand ready if there was some type of a humanitarian disaster or something that working through the UN or OAS or something, but I spend no time worrying about that. Now, to the airplane, yes. The airplane was on a counter-drug mission, flew, we know, about 3.5 minutes within the 12-mile limit, but no closer than 9 miles. It was actually not the mainland, but on an island. We admitted to it, apologized for it, and no issue. But great people, but we don't really work with them because State Department handles that.
The fact, the presence of the aircraft near does it have any relationship as they claim to the?
No. I mean, 3 years ago, the USS George Washington was scheduled to go around Latin America, because of course it can't go through the canal, it's too big, and go to Norfolk to be defueled and refueled 3 years ago. In doing that, it's making its way past. It's coming no closer to Venezuela, really, than the Caribbean. And so there's no relationship at all.
Gentleman in the fourth row.
Ted Voorhees, Covington and Burling. General, thanks for being here and thanks for your service. I'm tempted to ask one follow-up Venezuela question, unfortunately. There's news reports recently that Maduro has said that he's going to win this election, but if he doesn't win this election, nothing's going to change. Does that cause you any concern, and do you think it might raise the level of your engagement in Venezuela issues in coming months?
Honestly, I can't emphasize enough how little time I spend thinking about Venezuela. They're on their own course. People have got to work out. People don't think that they've got a good deal there now, economically, socially, and all that. They certainly can try to change it. That's up to them. I spend really no time worrying about Venezuela, other than, as I mentioned, if, God forbid, something bad happened there relative to humanitarian disaster or something like this, if I was told to help, but all of that would be done through, World Food and UN and that kind of thing. But, kind of back on the gentleman's comment there, as we were chasing what we knew was a boat that just put maybe a ton of cocaine, made a run out of Venezuela, put a ton of cocaine, and we were following it back to where it came from, to see where it came from. Would have been nice to get a little more cooperation from Venezuela in terms of this counter-drug thing. I can't emphasize enough, this drug influence is so corruptive, so detrimental to all of society, that any woman that has any sense of decency would want to join hands, shoulder to shoulder, together to get at this drug problem. And we have unbelievable cooperation from almost every country in Latin America. There's a couple that don't. I'll let it go at that.
Back there in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th row. Yeah.
So in Iraq and Afghanistan, Yeltsin Boguslavsky, Yale School of International Affairs. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the military developed a new independent and holistic paradigm of warfare to counter the insurgency. Is it possible that some kind of same new holistic paradigmatical approach could be developed in your region for the military to counter the transnational crime networks, especially now when the nexus between the crime and terrorism is growing? Thank you.
Yes, and in a sense it already has. I mean, we have heavy presence. We have a lot of presence in terms of U.S. Law enforcement, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, things like that, FBI, DEA. They're already working in many ways shoulder to shoulder with countries, some countries that are not politically friendly to us sometimes. They have great contacts. The problem in some of these countries, a big problem, we take for granted in the United States that we have police departments that really do protect and serve the American people. Very, very clean, little corruption. We take that for granted. We take for granted that we have the FBI and the NSA and the CIA and organizations like that that are constantly out there looking for threats, developing counter-network strategies, things like that, sharing with partner countries. The countries, particularly those that are on the transit routes of drugs, are so impacted by drug networks with these unlimited amounts of money to either bribe, intimidate, or kill, that these countries barely have, in some respects, functioning legal justice system when it comes to things other than, say, business law. Most of their police are very, very heavily corrupt or intimidated, so they don't do their job. And ironically, the militaries, as in our own country or in the United States, the military tends to be the most respected, admired institution in most of the countries that I work in, with the exception sometimes of the Catholic Church. They're the most accepted, the most admired. The people want to see them. I'll give the example of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. The police are completely intimidated by the violence or bribed away from doing their jobs. The military likes to, or the people like to see the military on the street. Two, 3 men, women, increasingly women, working alongside the police. The police are doing police work, but the military are there to oversee just make sure everyone's doing it honestly. We in the United States, most of the West, I think, don't see that a military is best used internally. The militaries that we deal with don't like to be used internally because it's really dirty business. They don't want to see their soldiers or Marines corrupted. But if that's all they got, if they're an extremist, if all they have, the only functioning security force is the military. By the way, they run the military through anywhere from 4 weeks to now 3 months, all police-type training, so they're not out there shooting first and asking questions later kind of thing. But as we see in France, no more progressive country in the world, what was their first reaction when the terrible tragedy happened on Friday? Their first reaction was to get soldiers and Marines into the streets. I myself, in my career, have been deployed once here in Washington on the streets because of the riots back in the 70s, and once in LA because of the race riots. So we ourselves do it. We don't like to do it. No one likes to do it. But if it's all you got, maintain some semblance of security as you try to rebuild your police. Vet them and rebuild them. That's a long process.
Did you have a, yeah?
Thank you. Thank you, General. My name is Jose Cardenas. I'm a consultant with Vision Americas here in Washington, and I served in Bush 43 in several Latin America positions. And I wanted to really thank you for your leadership at Southcom. Those of us who care about the hemisphere are going to miss you. Your candor, your candor, and frankly, you are practically the only U.S. official that has been speaking about the transnational criminal threat that we face from our southern direction. And I just hope that we don't find out the hard way what their ultimate capabilities are. I wanted to ask you about Colombia, going back to Colombia, and obviously a very controversial peace process underway. More controversial inside Colombia than outside Colombia, which tells you something there. But looking over the horizon, General, what do you see? Say that there is an agreement completed with the FARC. We're looking around March of next year. What do you see as the U.S. role, Southcom's role, in helping the Colombians win the peace? And we all know what that means. That means the implementation of the agreement and helping the Colombians do some things that they have never done before. And that is establish government presence in some of the conflict zones, weaning people away from the coca economy into sustainable jobs there. So that's going to be a huge challenge for the U.S. government, and specifically for Southcom, that has been so involved in Colombia for the last 15, 20 years.
It is a great question, and I guess I would start by saying the Colombians are remarkably capable people. Society, democracy. I sometimes hesitate to make any recommendations to the Colombians because they don't need much in the way of help. If you look at Plan Colombia, very little U.S. money. A lot of U.S. Intelligence and information sharing, a lot of U.S. encouragement, confidence in them. They really kind of did it all themselves. As far as the kind of things that they face, they have to take roughly 8,000 FARC and integrate them into society. I don't say reintegrate them, because remember, the FARC is a serial human rights violator and has been for years. They kidnapped the foot soldiers when they're 12, 13, 14 years old, and they make them camp workers. Young women get the added deal of being sex slaves for a few years until they get too old, I think 19, 20, and then they put them into the fighting forces, if you will. It's horrific what they do to the young people and to the young women. It's horrific. That said, they have integrated, not reintegrated, because these young people were never really part of society. the story, when I went to one of their reintegration sites a little over a year ago in Cali, there was a young woman there, she was just 29 years old, very, very attractive, and I say that because when she was about 12 and they came to the village, someone noticed her, and one of the FARC guys says, "We'll be back in a couple of years for you," and they came back and brought her into the FARC. She'd been pregnant, I think, 14 times. She entered the FARC when she was about 13, 14 pregnancies roughly, all of them jungle abortions. Because the FARC, unlike, say, Sendero Luminoso, don't allow them to have the choice. It's just horrific. So the point is that they have integrated 33,000 over the years of FARCsters who have come out on their own into their society with a pretty low return rate. So they know what they're doing. I think what the U.S. has to do is continue the assistance we're already providing them, and understand, as I think the Colombian government understands, the peace dividend. One of the first conversations I had with the most senior officials in Colombia, this is 3 years ago almost. You think the last 50 years has been hard? The first 10 after the peace agreement will be really hard. And I would say the same thing to my own to the United States. You've got to stick with them. It's probably maybe the only foreign policy success story we've had in the last 40 years. And we really don't provide them all that much other than encouragement and information and things like that. I think we ought to stand with them. They're our best partners. Oh, by the way, they are already contributing peacekeepers around the world. They're what they call exporting security. So they have sent teams to the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Central American countries. They go up, they send contact or mobile training teams out to talk human rights, coin tactics, anti-IED tactics. I mean, they are an incredibly responsible partner in the region and in the world. And as the violence, or if they get a peace agreement, you can bet they will reorient themselves. They're already planning it. They become more of a regional partner and more of a global partner. I'll end by saying they deployed for 6 months. Colombia is here. Somalia is here. They deployed one of their frigates to Somalia to join the counter-piracy operations there. And for a good portion of their time, protected ships going into Somalia to drop off food supplies. And they did that, small contribution, but they did that to make a statement to the world, certainly the United States, that we will become world players to the degree that they can do it, or participants in things like this more and more once they get out from under this FARC insurgency.
Okay, I think we've got time for just 2 more questions. So, gentleman right over there.
Good afternoon, General Kelly. I'm Scott Cooper with Human Rights First. I actually served in the Marine Corps under you several years ago. I wonder if I could draw you out again about defense reform. You mentioned that interagency reform is something to look at. I recall General Pace, when he was chairman, that was a constant theme of his. We need to make the interagency process work. You kind of hedged there and said I'd take a look at it. What ideas do you have for how we might make that work better in the future?
Yeah, I think the jointness of the U.S. military has worked so well. Before we were in 4 stovepipes, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a number of other stovepipes. And the stovepipes all right, at every level along. We're still working our own lanes, but there's constant communication all the way up. And of course, it's just natural to guys like me, men and women like me, that the jointness thing has worked and is a good thing. Again, back to the question. I think we always ought to be looking at things all the time, but it's the stovepipe. And if you work at, or if you look at the rest of the U.S. government, I always make the joke, but it's actually sadly true. Outside Washington, things actually work pretty well. If you go in my part of the world, the FBI agents and the DEA agents work together, like each other, go out for drinks after work. No rice bowl, but they're getting after it in my part of the world, and I suspect in other parts of the world. They're mission focused, and they know that they got to work together. HSI, Homeland Security investigations, the Department of Treasury, their office that goes after foreign threat financing. Out there it's working. Back here it's stovepiped. I mean, I get a lot of questions. I think because of the U.S. military's approach to jointness, that is to say, what's the problem? Let's work a solution. Let's put a plan together. Let's make it happen. Because of that, I'm probably outside my lane a lot. In fact, I know I am. And I'm constantly told this is not your job, whatever this is. And I say, I know it's kind of your job, but you're not doing it. So I'll do it. You can come to the conference in Miami or here in Washington. And it tends to then, people then are now oftentimes trying to run to catch up. So what I would say is, how do we break down those stovepipes so that people are talking to each other right along, so that you don't have to go to the Pentagon. Kelly doesn't have to go to the Pentagon, over to the Justice Department, then down into the bowels of the Justice Department to talk to the person. Why can't I simply call, and I do, people at whatever level and say, why don't you come to this conference in Miami? Or that kind of thing. So I think we could do better at it. The coordination just can't be done at the top. It's got to be, wide open, I think. So that's what I would say.
Okay, I think the lady over there will get the last question.
So it better be a good one.
No pressure. I'm Shun Murray. I'm a professor at the American University. And I'm curious about how you would describe whether you would describe having a diplomatic role in Southcom, and how you work with the State Department, and whether there's a tension between your regional outlook and their primarily bilateral outlook.
Yeah. It's a great question. And first of all, I would never say I have a diplomatic role. That is the State Department's role. But I have an incredible partnership development role. But certainly there's different cultures, the U.S. military and the State Department. But I have very, very good relationships with almost all of the military. So the military, that includes the ministers of defense, very, very good. In many, many, many countries, personal relationships with the presidents. I never try to violate that. I mean, the U.S. ambassador is, or at least his label, his or her label is, the senior or the senior representative president of the United States in that country. I think probably all of the COCOMs have tremendous relationships with the ambassadors in the country teams, and within those country teams, FBI, DEA, all of that kind of thing. Some very, very, very good relationships. But you're right, it's very definitely bilateral. So the ambassador in pick your country deals with Washington. I was surprised, for example, when we were developing this more regional approach with the Central American countries, that the problems of the three, particularly of northern tier countries, and I'd throw Belize into that as well, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and I'd throw Belize in risky, not quite on the edge, but we've got to include them in on the discussion. I was surprised when we were working this alliance with Barbaria and everything that the ambassadors in those countries weren't talking to each other. We in the military, have this kind of biased reaction. So when we go into something, the first thing we start figuring out is what are my authorities, what are my prerogatives, who's on my right, who's on my left. I start talking to them. So I was actually, as I say, surprised that there's not a lot of conversation amongst the ambassadors. It's just the way they work. And the responsibility for the regional approach is in big state here in D.C. So that's the way they do it. But there's certainly no conflict. I've had ambassadors call, and the ambassadors call me all the time for help. Sometimes for help, State Department. Can you convince them that? I think it's a trust thing. There was one country I won't go into it, Central American country, when I first took over. They had an event there where, and this is and I'll end with this maybe, but this is something that military people have got to keep in mind, and we forget sometimes. We have a very different language. We have a very different way of operating, and we need to look at the people we're dealing with people in our own government and appreciate that. So this one ambassador was very, very, I mean, it happened before my time, but an event, it was a counter-drug operation that, in my view, as a military guy, didn't go that bad, but embarrassed the country team, not embarrassed. The country team was not ready for the possibility of violence. And when there was violence, it caught them completely off guard, or at least the ambassador. And one of my first trips was to go down there and on my, just getting around in the new job. And the ambassador was telling me about how she hadn't been briefed on this, and it caught her by surprise, and no one had ever told her there would be violence. I said, okay, you have trained by DEA local forces at night going into places where there are narco-terrorists, drug traffickers, and why did you not think there could be some violence? But again, our fault. We did not brief her, before my time, we did not brief her enough on the possibilities. Well, this is what happens if it works perfectly, this is what happens if it doesn't work perfectly, and this is what happens if it really goes bad. Now, again, back to the way you look at it. In my world, working perfectly would be getting the drugs, and if you had a gunfight and killed some bad guys, that's still in the perfectly column. In her world, and I'm not making a joke, it's just the differences. So we have, I have endeavored to be very close to the ambassadors, do anything they ask me to do, or don't do anything, and always do it, but to trust them. And as I tell, when I worked for Secretary Panetta and Secretary Gates, one thing, wonderful gentlemen, one thing they said is, when you have people come in here to brief me, have them speak English, not military, and those god-awful slides. Don't come in here and try to razzle-dazzle me with the slides. I think military people need to remember that. We have a culture that we need to somehow mesh into other people's cultures. Otherwise, it's this kind of thing, and that doesn't do the country you're dealing with any good. It certainly doesn't do the interagency process any good.
Okay. Well, what a great discussion. Thank you for that, and thank you for a career of extraordinary and exemplary service to our country.
Thank you.